A pair of small shoes sat on the kitchen table, and the man who was about to sell them had just buried the child who wore them. It was winter in a little Iowa town, and the ground was hard, and the baby had been in it for less than a day, 2 years old. The boy had died while his father was off on a drinking spree that had lasted the better part of 2 weeks, and the man came home only when the money ran out. And he held his son's body in his arms in the back room and swore on everything he had left that he would never touch another drink as long as he lived. He meant it, the way drowning men mean things. Then he walked back into the front room, picked up his dead boy's shoes off the floor, carried them down to the corner, and pawned them for the price of a bottle. That man would one day stand in front of crowds of thousands. He would build rescue missions in more than 60 American cities, from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic, places where the worst men in the country walked in off the street drunk and broken, and walked back out sober and whole. Tens of thousands of the lowest, hardest, most hopeless human beings this nation produced would trace the day their lives turned around to a room he opened and a hand he put on their shoulder. Presidents would know his name. The city of Grand Rapids would mourn him like a king. This is the story of Mel Trotter. And it is not a story about a good man who did good things. It's a story about the kind of man you would have crossed the street to avoid. It's about what happens when a person sinks so far down that there is genuinely nothing left to lose, and finds out that the bottom is exactly where grace was waiting the whole time. It's about the difference between a man being finished and a man only thinking he's finished. If you've ever looked at your own life and decided it was too late, that you'd wasted too much, hurt too many people, fallen too far to ever be of any use to anyone, then put it in the comments right now. He's not done with me yet, because the whole point of where we're going is that the people God reaches for are almost never the ones the rest of us would pick. Melvin Ernest Trotter was born in 1870 in a small town in northern Illinois into a home where the trouble started before he could walk. His father ran a saloon and drank up most of what the saloon brought in. That was the first thing Mel ever learned about being a man, watching his own father behind a bar, and it went into him deep, the way the things we see before we have words for them always do. He was a bright boy, quick with his hands, quick with people, the kind of kid who could make a room laugh. He had a gift, and in another life it might have built something. In this one, it mostly helped him get into bars he had no business being in. He took up barbering as a trade, and he was good at it. There was a season when he was young where the whole thing could have gone the other way. He had skill, he had charm, people liked him. But by the time he was a teenager, he was already drinking hard, and barbering and drinking went together in those days the way they should never have. A barber stood on his all day, made small talk, and the saloon was always next door. He would do good work for a week, get paid, and disappear for 3 days. He'd come back, beg his way into the job again, work another stretch, and vanish again. Every employer he ever had went through the same cycle with him, the same hope and the same disappointment, until the hope ran out and he was let go. He married a girl named Lottie. By every account, she was a patient, decent woman, and she loved him in the way that good women sometimes love men who are killing themselves, which is to say completely, and against all the evidence. She believed every promise he made. She had to, or she couldn't have stayed. And he made a lot of promises. He made them sober, and he made them hungover, and he made them on his knees, and he broke every single one. Lottie would set out food they couldn't really afford, and he wouldn't come home to eat it. She'd hear secondhand where he'd been seen. She would lie awake listening for his step on the porch and hear nothing night after night, and in the morning she'd get up and do it all again. Here was a man with a trade in his hands, a wife who adored him, and a baby boy. By any honest accounting, he had more than most, and he was throwing it into the gutter with both hands and couldn't stop, and the note being able to stop is the part that the people who've never been there will never understand. Everybody told him to just quit. His mother told him. Lottie told him. He told himself 1,000 times in the gray light of 1,000 mornings that today was the day. And then noon would come, and the want would rise up in him like water filling a hole, and by evening he'd be face down somewhere with no memory of how he got there. Then the boy got sick. It was the kind of childhood illness that took children all the time in those years, the kind nobody could do much about. And it didn't happen fast. The little boy lay there day after day, getting weaker, and his mother sat by him, and the one person who should have been in that room was out somewhere with a glass in his hand. Mel had gone on a binge, not a night, not 2 nights. He was gone for the worst of it, gone while his son's breathing got shallower, gone while his wife held the boy alone and waited for a door that didn't open. When he finally came home, broke and shaking and sick with himself, the boy was nearly gone, and Mel got there in time to take him out of Lottie's arms and feel the last of the life leave that small body against his chest. Something in a man should break for good in a moment like that. And something in Mel did break. He stood there and he made the most sincere vow of his entire life. Never again. Not one more drop. He would honor this child's memory with his sobriety if it killed him. He believed it. He felt it down to the floor of his soul. And then there was the funeral, and the cold ground, and the walk back to an empty house, and that terrible want came up in him one more time. Stronger than grief, stronger than shame, stronger than love. And he looked around the house for something, anything, that could be turned into a drink. And his eyes landed on his dead son's shoes. He took them down to a man he knew, and he sold them, and he drank the money. That is the thing about this disease that the comfortable can't bear to look at directly. It will make a father sell the shoes off his buried child's feet, and it will do it the same week he wept over the coffin and meant every tear. Mel Trotter was not a monster. That's what makes it unbearable. He was a man who loved his son and could not put down the bottle long enough to save either one of them. After that, there was nowhere lower in himself to go, so he went lower in the world instead. The marriage couldn't hold the weight of it. He drifted. He lost the trade, lost the town, lost whatever scraps of reputation he had left. He rode the rails. He slept where men with no money sleep, which in that era meant doorways and flophouses and the floors of jails. He pawned his coat in the dead of winter. He pawned his shoes too, his own this time, and walked in the snow in his socks. He had become, by his own later telling, exactly the kind of man that respectable people looked through as though he weren't there at all. A drunk on the street, a thing to step around. He landed in Chicago in the middle of January in the worst winter cold with nothing. No coat, no money, no work, no wife waiting, no boy, no town that would have him, no bottom left to fall to. And somewhere in that long freezing night he made up his mind to do the only thing that seemed left to do. He would go down to the lake and walk out into it and let the cold finish what the whiskey had started. He'd had enough. He was 26 years old, and he had decided his life was over. And by every reasonable measure of who he was and what he'd done, who could have argued with him? He started walking toward the water. What he didn't know, walking through those streets with murder in his heart aimed at himself, was that there was a lit doorway on the route he'd chosen, and a man standing in it. The Pacific Garden Mission was one of those rescue missions that dotted the rough districts of American cities back then. A storefront with a cross and a coffee pot, and a few rows of chairs, where men preached the gospel to the kind of audience nobody else wanted. It was run by people who had figured out that the gutter was not beneath God's notice, that in fact the gutter was where he seemed to do some of his best work. On this particular night, a man connected to the mission was out on the sidewalk, and he saw Mel coming, saw at a glance exactly what he was and where he was probably headed, and he stopped him. He talked to him. He got him to come inside, out of the cold, just for a little while, just to sit down, just to get warm. Mel went in because it was warm, and for no holier reason than that. He sat in the back, the way men like him always sit in the back, close to the door, ready to bolt. He was drunk. He was planning to leave the second he could feel his feet again and finish what he'd started. He heard the singing, and it meant nothing to him. He heard a man get up front and start to preach, and he meant to ignore that too. But the man preaching that night had been where Mel was. That was the thing about these missions, the thing that made them work when nothing else did. The man at the front wasn't a stranger to the life. He'd been a hard case himself once, and when a man who has actually been to the bottom stands up and tells you that he was there, in the exact place you are sitting right now, in the same hopelessness, in the same shame, and that he got out, you listen differently than you've ever listened to anybody safe and clean who never knew. Mel listened. He didn't want to, but he listened, and the words started getting underneath the drink, down to the place where the grief over his boy still lived. down to the part of him that had stopped believing it could ever be different. That night, in the back of a storefront mission in Chicago, in January of 1897, Mel Trotter prayed. He didn't do it eloquently. He didn't have a theology. He just got down and said, more or less, that he was done, that he couldn't do it himself, that if there was a God who could do anything with a man like him, here he was, and there wasn't much of him left. And he meant it the way he'd meant the vow over his son. Except this time he wasn't promising God anything. He had finally learned that his promises were worthless. This time he was asking. And something happened in that room that he could never afterward fully explain, except to say that the man who walked into that mission to get warm before drowning himself walked out a different man entirely. Now here is where most people would expect the story to wobble. We've all heard the man who gets religion on a hard night and is back in the bottle by the weekend. Mel knew that man. Mel had been that man dozens of times, with his vows, so nobody who knew him would have bet a dime on it lasting. The want was still in him. It didn't vanish. The first weeks were a war, and he fought them 1 hour at a time, the way it has to be fought, and the people at the mission fought alongside him and wouldn't let him go. But it held. The thing that all his iron-jawed vows could never do, this surrender did. Day by day it held. He didn't drink. He found work. He sent for Lottie, and Lottie, who had every right in the world to spit in his face and slam the door, came and saw with her own eyes that something had genuinely changed, that the eyes looking back at her were her husband's again and not the stranger's. The marriage that the bottle had broken was put back together, not in a week and not without scars, but really and for good. And Mel discovered he had a gift, the one that had been buried under the drink the whole time. He could talk. He could stand up in front of a roomful of the hardest, most cynical, most hung-over men in the city. Men who had heard every sermon and believed none of them. Men who could smell a phony at 50 paces. And he could hold them. Because he wasn't a phony, he was one of them. When he said he understood, they could see in his face that he did. When he told them there was a way out, they could see he had walked it. He started helping at the mission, then preaching at it. And the men who came in off those Chicago streets started getting up out of those chairs the way he had. In 1900, just a few years after the night he'd intended to die, a group in Grand Rapids, Michigan, who were trying to start a rescue mission of their own, asked Mel Trotter to come and run it. He was barely sober 3 years. By worldly standards, he was a recovering nobody with a ruined past and no education to speak of. They handed him a mission anyway, and he took it, and he poured the rest of his life into it. And the city rescue mission of Grand Rapids became the great work of his days and the model for what he would build everywhere else. What he understood, because he had lived it, was that you cannot preach a starving man into the kingdom. You feed him first. You get him out of the cold. You get coffee into him. You get shoes on his feet. And then when he is warm and fed and has felt, maybe for the first time in years, that somebody in this world counted him worth the trouble, then you tell him about the one who counted him worth dying for. Mel's missions ran on that order: soup, soap, and salvation, the old rescue men used to say, and they said it in that order on purpose. He never forgot the cold of that January night, never forgot what a warm room and a kind word had done for a man who'd come to kill himself. He built warm rooms for the rest of his life, and he did not build just one. The thing caught fire. Mel would go into a city, a hard city with a skid row full of men everybody else had given up on, and he'd raise the money and find the building and train the workers and get a mission running, and then he'd move on and do it again. Over the course of his ministry, he planted these missions in city after city across the country. More than 60 of them by the time he was through, a chain of lit doorways stretching coast to coast, each one positioned exactly where the broken men walked, each one staffed by people who knew that no one is ever too far gone. He raised up other men to run them, many of them former drunks themselves, men he'd pulled out of the same gutter he'd been pulled from, who now stood where he had once stood and did for others what had been done for them. He had a way of preaching that people came from all over to hear. It wasn't fancy. He used plain words, and he used his own story without flinching from the ugly parts. He'd tell about the shoes. He never hid it, never cleaned it up to make himself look better. He told rooms full of respectable churchgoers that he had sold his dead baby's shoes for a drink, and you could hear a pin drop. because he wasn't telling it for shock. He was telling it so that the worst person in the room would understand that if God could do something with a man like that, there was hope for anybody at all. That was always his message, underneath every sermon. If he could reach me, he can reach you. It made fine church-going folks weep, and it made hopeless men dare to hope. And it was true, and everybody could tell it was true. And that is why it worked when polished men with clean histories couldn't move the same crowds an inch. There was a price to it, the way there's always a price. He traveled constantly. He wore himself out. He was forever raising money, which is grinding, humbling work, going hat in hand to people who could give, year after year, so that the soup kept coming and the doors stayed open, and the lights stayed on in 60 cities. He carried the weight of all those men's relapses, because not every man who walked in walked out whole. Some came back drunk a dozen times before it took, and some never came back at all. And Mel grieved every one of them like the son he'd lost. He gave up rest and comfort and quiet and the simple, ordinary life he might have had. He chose to spend himself completely on the very kind of man he used to be. And he did it joyfully. That was the strange and beautiful thing about him that everyone remarked on. A man who had been through what he'd been through, who carried what he carried, was not grim. He was full of life. He laughed easily, the old gift for filling a room, except now it filled the room with something clean. People who met him expected a somber reformed drunkard, and got instead a man practically lit up from the inside, because he genuinely could not get over what had happened to him. He'd been dead and he was alive. He'd been the man. Everyone stepped around on the sidewalk, and now governors took his calls. How do you not laugh when that's your life? How do you not give the whole thing away when you remember the cold of the lake you were walking toward? The missions outlived him, which is how you know a work is real. He didn't build something that depended on his being there to keep it standing. He built something that kept on going, that's still going to this day. More than a century later, the great mission in Grand Rapids, still carrying his name and still doing the exact work he started, still pulling the lowest men and women in that city out of the cold and feeding them and telling them they're not finished. Generations of the hopeless have come through those doors since the man himself went home. That's the kind of thing one redeemed drunk can leave behind. He preached and built and traveled and gave himself away for 40 years. By the end, his health was used up. He'd burned the candle from both ends for 4 decades, and there wasn't much wax left, and he knew it, and he didn't seem to mind. He died in 1940, in Grand Rapids, in the city that had become his home and the heart of his life's work. The man who had once been a corpse in waiting on a frozen cacao street. The barber who couldn't keep a job, the husband who broke every promise, the father who sold his dead son's shoes, died beloved, with thousands of rescued lives standing as the monument over his grave. They mourned him across the country, men who had been murderers and thieves and drunks, men he'd personally hauled up out of the pit, wept like children when they got the news. Take the count of it. 60-some missions. Tens of thousands of men and women pulled out of the deepest holes a human being can fall into. Whole families put back together. Children given fathers again. A chain of mercy still running today in cities that have long forgotten how it started. And all of it came out of one man whom everybody, including himself, had completely written off. One drunk. One failure. One funeral with a pair of missing shoes. So what's the excuse? Too broken? Mel Trotter sold his dead child's shoes for whiskey and slept in the snow without a coat and walked toward a lake to drown. There is no version of broken you can name that he didn't live below. Too far gone? He was a hopeless case in the technical and complete sense of the word. Given up on by his employers, his town, his own wife, and finally by himself. Too late, too much wasted, too many years thrown away. He didn't start the work of his life until he'd already wrecked the first half of it past all repair. And God built 60 missions out of the wreckage anyway. That's the thing we keep coming back to, here at this channel, telling these stories one after another. The Lord does not seem to want the people the world would draft first. He keeps reaching past the qualified and the clean and the impressive, and putting his hand on the one in the back by the door, the one who came in just to get warm, the one with the worst record, and the least to offer, and nothing left to bargain with. He does it on purpose. He does it so that nobody can ever stand at the front of one of those missions and take the credit, because everybody in the room knows exactly what that man used to be. If God could do that with him, the logic runs, then there is no one beyond reach. Maybe. Especially not you. If something in this story got hold of you, if you've been carrying around the quiet certainty that your own past has disqualified you for good, do this. Put it in the comments where you'll have to read it back. He's not done with me yet. And then don't just type it and scroll on. Take it somewhere. This week, find a quiet hour by yourself where nobody's listening and say the thing Mel said in the back of that mission. Not a promise. He'd learned his promises were worthless, and so have you. Just the asking. Here I am, and there isn't much left, and I'm done trying to fix it myself. That prayer has emptied more bottles and rebuilt more lives than every iron vow ever made. Hit the bell and like, and subscribe to Circle of Witnesses, because there are more of these to come, and the next one will leave a mark on you the same way, because there was another man in another country who started out even further down than Mel Trotter ever fell. A man the courts had already condemned. A man with a noose, quite literally, waiting for him. And the warden who was supposed to oversee his hanging would be the one who watched him become something no one in that prison could explain. How does a sentenced killer become a saint his guards are afraid to be alone with? What happens in a man when he has truly nothing left, not even tomorrow? Stay with us and find out what grace does when it walks into a death row cell and refuses to leave.